Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Another news is pressure on the Chancellor after yesterday's budget, with leading economists warning that the economy may not recover from the 2008 financial crisis until the 2060s.
Average earnings look like they'll be nearly £1,400 a year lower than forecast back then, and still below their 2008 level. So we're in danger of losing not just one, but getting on for 2 decades of earnings growth.
Our economics editor Ed Conway has been listening to the full IFS speech, joining us now from central London, as you can see. Hello to you, Ed. So this is when we see the nuts and bolts. This is when we manage to drill down on exactly what we heard yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. It's the post-match analysis, or the post-mortem in some years. And you were mentioning the 2060s. What Paul Johnson was talking about there was total national debt, because the economy is not growing as fast. It means that we've got a slightly higher national debt in the future. And let's just show you that in graphical terms, because it really depends on how fast the economy is growing. This shows you debt as a percentage of GDP, and it's risen very high. As you can see, it's gone up from about 40% to about 80% at the moment. If you're being optimistic, you think it gets down relatively quickly over the next few years. But even so, that both relies on growth being strong and it relies on there being a surplus. In other words, the government basically being able to eliminate the deficit. And we know at the moment they can't do that. So a more realistic probability is actually that debt comes down even slower than that. And if you think growth is going to be as weak as they thought it was today, then you're talking about an even bigger pile of national debt come 2060. So we're still living with that scar of the crisis for quite some time. And that was one main message from the IFS today. Another, though, was when it came to health spending. I think a lot of people curious as to whether we really are seeing an extra rise in health spending as a result of those changes we heard about from the Chancellor yesterday. Now, if you look at it on a per capita basis, health spending has indeed risen a little bit in recent years, and according to the new spending plans, is going up. This just compares the levels at the moment with all the way back in 2009-10. It does look like it's going up, doesn't it? But that doesn't take account of the fact that the population is ageing, and if you adjust for that, which the IFS has done today, actually health spending per capita is more or less flatlining despite all this extra money. The actual kind of amount that we're filling per capita, age adjusted, is basically flatlining over that entire period. So not quite as generous as it might have seemed yesterday. But overall, having a look at the population as a whole, this is a chart that we always look at every single time they do it. The distributional analysis from the poorest to the richest, who benefits or indeed loses out as a result of the changes we've heard from the Chancellor. Well, from this budget, actually everyone gains. From the poorest to the richest, everyone is getting an increase in their income. But take account of the fact that we've had 2 previous budgets that have had quite a lot of cuts, and look at how the picture changes. A big fall for the less well-off as a result of the freeze in working age benefits. That's largely what explains that. And the richest doing best as a result of those policies which have built up, so the previous policies. So good news from this budget, but overall, across the kind of income spectrum, you're talking still about taking from the poor and giving to the rich.
Well, let's return to the budget and that grim economic forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility. The independent watchdog downgraded its predictions of growth for each of the next 5 years as a result of the UK's continuing poor productivity performance. Well, let's take a closer look at what the OBR said. The economy is expected to grow by 1.5% this year. Now, that's down from the estimate of 2% that was made in March. It also said that growth will drop by 1.3% all the way along in 2020 before rising to 1.5% in 2021 and then on to 1.6%. It means that by 2022, government tax receipts will be £20 billion lower than initially predicted, so less money in the purse, and this will then lead to a slower fall in borrowing as a share of economic output. Now, that's thought it will also make it harder for the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, to meet his target of bringing borrowing down to less than 50% of GDP by 2020 to 2021. So what is that going to mean for people across the country? I'm joined now by Torsten Bell, director of the Resolution Foundation think tank, which works to improve people's standards of living, and Sam Bowman from the free market think tank, the Adam Smith Foundation. Torsten Bell, to you first of all, given the fact that the OBR have got predictions very wrong in the past, how much weight do you attach to these figures yesterday?
Well, I think everybody should take all forecasts with a big pinch of salt. But what yesterday, most of the debate about the forecast focused on was this big downgrade to our productive potential as an economy, our productivity, and what that meant for GDP and what that meant for the public finances. What we're really saying is within the weeds of the budget documents, these have big implications for family finances, for our pay levels in the future and for our family incomes. And that really is what matters.
And how, Torsten, does that affect those that you are working hard to improve their quality of life? What impact do you think these figures, which a lot of people may look at and not fully understand, what do they mean to an average family over the next 5 years?
Well, these forecasts are actually bad for all families, all incomes, high or low. Lower productivity means weaker wage growth. The OBR is predicting average earnings to be £1,000 less than they previously thought they would be. That is bad for everybody. The thing that is bad, particularly for lower income households, is big cuts to benefits that lower income and working families rely on that are coming through over the next few years. And those mean that we think over £700 is going to be taken away from the bottom third of families, while tax cuts give a few £100s to the richest third of families. So things are tough for everyone, but the tax and benefit choices the government have made will drive up inequality.
Sam Bowman from the Adam Smith Institute. Do you think the Chancellor did enough to try to spur productivity in that budget yesterday?
Not really. I'm relieved that he ignored some of the calls from his own party to kind of splurge money on, for example, changing tuition fee repayment rates and things like that. But really what we need to boost productivity is two things. Number one, sort out the housing problem so that it's much easier and much more affordable for people to move to the parts of the country where the jobs are. The big problem is that even though we're looking at quite high house building this year, many of those houses aren't actually in London and the southeast where the best jobs are. So people are priced out by rents and house prices from moving to where they can become more productive. And this is a problem that the United States has as well. It could really be the silver bullet the UK needs for productivity growth in the short term. In the longer term, though, one of the big problems we have is that we underinvest massively in this country. Businesses in the UK invest less in capital and machinery than all but two other European countries. One of them is Portugal. And one of the reasons for that is that we make it very difficult in the tax system for businesses to invest. So what we should be doing, as well as sorting out the housing crisis by making it much, much easier to build within existing residential areas and on greenbelt sites, we should also be changing the corporation tax system so that businesses that do invest can deduct the cost of that investment from their corporation tax bill. They're moving towards that in the US. There's a lot of good evidence that it would really spur business investment, and that's the sort of thing that we need to get more productivity and ultimately higher wages and growth.
Torsten, do you agree with any of that, that actually in order fundamentally to get high wages across the country, we do need to encourage business, we need to help business, and if we don't do that, it's pointless just simply giving people extra benefits. We need to look at the long term, the creation of jobs and better jobs.
Okay, let's be careful here. It's not about giving people extra benefits. We're talking about benefits that are being taken away. But where Sam is totally right is that housing is a huge challenge facing this country, both one of productivity, but also one of living standards, and housing costs are significantly squeezing families' budgets and have been in a growing way since the 1980s. That is a huge problem, and the Chancellor was totally right yesterday to put that challenge front and centre in his budget. But Sam is also right that actually doing something about that is going to take huge and sustained effort. And in the end, that's going to involve the private sector building more homes, but there is no way to get up to the kind of building levels we need and the kind of affordable housing we need without the state itself rolling up its sleeves and getting on with some building.
Sam Bowman, you know, the things that you talked about increasing productivity are relatively long-term things. Do you not think that more could have been done by the Chancellor? You know, as Torsten says, get house building underway right now, encourage productivity right now, make changes faster rather than looking at the long view?
Well, I think that we do need to realise that housing in particular is effectively a national emergency, and I think housing should be given as much prominence and attention as Brexit is being given. It could be one of those things that actually turns out to be more important in the long term than Brexit is. The really worrying thing about the productivity numbers is that they don't actually factor in Brexit, and I think everybody agrees that in the short term at least, Brexit's going to be very disruptive, and it's going to lower trade and lower immigration, which means lower productivity, even lower than the government is predicting at the moment. So these are really worrying things, and By all accounts, Philip Hammond, I think, does recognise the challenge in housing. I think he does recognise that the planning system that we have is a huge barrier to more construction, whether it's by the private sector or by local councils. But it seems as if the Chancellor is being hemmed in by his own party, particularly by the Prime Minister, Theresa May, who ruled out any kind of change to Greenbelt building. And effectively, that means you just can't let the private sector go anymore. It's so difficult to navigate the planning system. This is the reason that we have land banking, incidentally, because home developers basically need to guarantee a supply of land that they can build on over the next 4 or 5 years so that their workers and equipment can actually be in use. But the fact that Theresa May has maintained that kind of protection, supposedly protection for Greenbelt land, I think is a huge, huge problem. And I don't think the problem is the Chancellor. I think the problem is the Prime Minister and many people within their party who are refusing, even though they're talking the talk on housing, refusing to change the rules of the game so that it's much easier for existing home builders and for new home builders to come into the market and build the houses that we need in the places that we need them. It's that key point. The houses need to be in places like London, Oxford, Cambridge and the South East. That's what the part of the country that's growing, and that's the place that most people who want to improve their lives are trying to move, but they're being priced out. So I have a lot of sympathy for Philip Hammond. I suspect if he had more freedom of action, he would have done something much more radical, but he doesn't have that. So I think that everybody, particularly within the Conservative Party, needs to start speaking up for that kind of reform.
OK, Torsten, I mean, what do you think about the housing plans, the losing of stamp duty up to 300,000, 500,000 in London and the more home building? I mean, do you have any sympathy for Philip Hammond at all, or do you think he's doing the right thing?
No, he's done the right thing by putting housing front and centre in his budget, and he's done the right thing putting some more money, more capital spending into house building through what's called the Housing Infrastructure Fund, and some extra cash into local authorities, allowing them to build social rented properties. Those are all very welcome. Unfortunately, the single biggest item of spending on housing is this stamp duty cut that you mentioned for first-time buyers, which you completely understand sounds like something that should be popular with first-time buyers. They think they're going to get a tax cut that will help them get on the housing ladder, that they're very frustrated about how difficult it is. But the truth is, as the OBR said yesterday, that will actually put up prices. It will probably put prices up by more than the tax cut that the individuals receive, and it doesn't get at the core problem, which is how do we get more houses built. And spending £3 billion on a tax cut that will only increase the number of homeowners by 3,500 a year at a cost of £160,000 per person is a really, really inefficient way to do it.
Sam Bowman was saying, you know, that he believes that the real solution is just simply more homes, South East England, Oxford, Cambridge, that area. Is that something you would echo, or do you feel this is something that's a countrywide problem?
Well, building more homes is a very sensible thing, and building more homes in areas of very high housing costs, like the areas that Sam mentions, would be a very sensible thing to do. The only thing I would say is, though, that the housing crisis is not just about the south east of England. We are seeing rising we're not seeing right now, but over the last 20 years, we have seen significantly rising housing costs facing families right across this country, and we are seeing declining home ownership also taking place in huge swathes of Britain. In Greater Manchester, in Leeds, we've seen very significant falls in home ownership. In parts of the north east, we've also seen rises in housing costs since the 1990s. These are serious problems, and they need answers across the whole country.
Sam Bowman, very briefly, it has been suggested perhaps that it might be a better idea that the government spent this money that they're going to lose on the stamp duty on council house building, and wouldn't that be a better use of this money in the long run, providing actual homes that can stay in social use over the years, rather than simply funding more people on the property ladder and firing up the market?
Well, I think, almost all economists, whether they're left or right, agree that stamp duty is a very bad tax. But the reason isn't because it makes it more unaffordable for first-time buyers. The reason is that it disincentivises older people who might want to downsize from doing so. So a lot of the housing stock, these big family homes that now just have two people living in them, or even one person living in them, are being kind of locked into those owners because they would face a huge tax bill, or there would be less money in their property. That we called on the government to abolish stamp duty altogether and to recoup the money by making council tax more progressive, so that those big houses paid more council tax. I'm disappointed that the government's focused on first-time buyers. I don't think it's a big bung to them, but we should be clear. There's a difference between paying £5,000 extra for a house and paying £5,000 to the government in a tax bill. You don't get the £5,000 back when you sell the house. That's the point. A house being £5,000 more expensive does make it slightly more unaffordable at the margin now, but you will get that money back, which isn't the case when you pay that money in stamp duty. But I think the government really missed the point of the stamp duty reform and really missed what really gumming up the market.
OK, Sam and Torsten, thank you both very much. I think that £5,000 thing will be a big thing for a lot of people, it has to be said. The UK is in danger of losing almost 20 years of growth in earnings. That's the stark warning from the Institute of Fiscal Studies after yesterday's budget. The independent think tank says the squeeze on living standards in the past 10 years is unprecedented and warns that the economic outlook is grim. It says there's no imminent end to austerity and government borrowing is now expected to rise for decades. The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, said he hoped to prove the forecasts wrong and insisted his budget was a package for families feeling the pressure. Our economics editor Kamal Ahmed reports.
It can all seem a little distant. The Treasury, the government department that publishes the budget. But what this grand Office of State says matters for all of us. And today it became clear why. The budget's major growth downgrade revealed the amount we earn has not increased for a decade, however hard we work and however far we travel. And those stagnant wages could be with us well into the next decade. Out shopping in Basildon, Essex, Adele and her daughter Emily. It's a struggle making ends meet.
I mean, I've been working years and I haven't had a pay rise at all, and I now have a child. How everything else has gone up, rent's gone up, food's gone up, all the other prices, gas, electric, we're constantly getting told this is going up, but nothing else is going up with it.
I asked the head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies why that growth downgrade mattered so much.
Economic forecasts might not sound terribly important, but when they mean that your earnings and your living standards are going to be much lower than you expected, then it's time to listen. Earnings in the early 2020s will still be below where they were in 2008, making this easily the worst decade and a bit for living standards, not just in living memory, but a long time before that too.
The Prime Minister visiting a college for training builders in Leeds. She knows she has to convince people like Adele she's on her side.
Both the Chancellor and I agree that what the budget was about jobs for people up and down the country. It was about ensuring people are in work with that income for their family. It's about building the homes that they need, and it's about ensuring that we seize the opportunities for the future.
That effort to seize the opportunities of the future has to overcome a major hurdle, the living standards squeeze. At the time of the financial crisis, average earnings were £24,500. They fell sharply as the financial crisis bit. And look how slow the recovery has been. Even by 2022, people will still be earning less on average than they were 10 years ago.
That is the key question. Why aren't real incomes rising? There are a number of answers to that. Firstly, the governments that over many decades of whichever party have failed to invest in the things that really matter, like our skills. The financial crisis, which sucked so much money out of the financial system, and the businesses themselves, some of which seem to prefer to rely on cheap labour rather than investing in the machinery that would make them more efficient and their employees wealthier.
For the government's opponents, there are those deep-seated economic problems.
And it's those delivering our key services, the nurses, the midwives, the firefighters, the teachers, who are worse off than they were a decade ago. There's nothing here, nothing that can be considered remotely strong.
People have been helped, the Tories say, with record employment levels, a higher living wage. And tonight, the government was putting the finishing touches to the next effort at boosting the economy. The industrial strategy. Stand by for that next week. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News.
The Chancellor insists his budget will address Britain's problems with productivity despite the gloomy forecasts. But low productivity is one of the biggest factors behind the poor outlook for growth. Our business editor, Simon Jack, considers what's been going wrong.
It's the word of the week, maybe the decade. It means the value of work done per worker per hour. If it goes up, the economy grows, and so do pay and living standards. When it doesn't, they don't. Right now, it isn't. Now, when people hear our productivity is low, some people wonder, are workers being accused of being lazy? But it's not really that at all. I could be the best typist in the world, the hardest working person, but there'd be a limit to how many letters, for example, I could write. To really get things done, to be more productive, I need one of these. It's a problem Britain's biggest companies recognise.
I mean, all the data suggests we do have a productivity problem. It's flatlined largely for the last few years, and you know, I think everybody recognises that. And I think both companies and government and indeed education in general, we all have a stake in making that and in fixing that and making that better.
The government's answer has been to get big companies like BT to pay 0.5% of their wage bill into an apprenticeship kitty that smaller companies can also use. But the latest figures show it's not working. This time last year, 117,000 people started an apprenticeship. Same time this year, that number was only 68,000. That's a fall of a whopping 59%. So, what's going wrong?
The implementation of this policy has been diabolical. The inflexible approach to training, the 10% charge to employers when they used to have it for free, and then the procurement process for providers, all three of them have caused immense problems, and that is why the numbers have fallen.
The problem doesn't seem to be demand from the apprentices themselves.
My mum always wanted me to go to university, but I always had to tell her that going to university, it doesn't give you the best thing ever. So like going to university gives you a degree, which is really good. But however, doing an apprenticeship, you get paid, you get a better opportunity, you learn skills, you meet new people.
If we're going to tackle the productivity puzzle, we really need to see a massive increase in training, and that means getting people doing apprenticeships in the right areas, the right industries. It's one of the top 3 issues that our members tell us they want to see solved.
The government said today it remains committed to providing 3 million apprenticeships by 2020. To hit that target, the plan may need a rewrite. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Let's talk to our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, who is in Westminster. So the forecasts are grim, Laura, but is the Chancellor hoping that more clarity on Brexit could change that?
Well, so if you're looking at what we've learned today, there's not much for him to be cheery about. The Tories' original economic plans are years off. The picture in the next few years looks pretty glum all round. And of course, in the background, there are question marks over Brexit. Will it have a good effect or a bad effect? And they hover over everything in the air here in Westminster. But in the political scores, ministers felt there were 2 big things that they had to get right before Christmas after a pretty bad summer and autumn for the Tories. The first was to get through a budget relatively unscathed, and the second was to persuade the rest of the EU to move on to talking about business in the future at a really critical summit meeting that will take place just before Christmas. In the last 24 hours, they do feel in government that they have pretty much achieved the first task. Not that they've sorted out all the country's economic problems, but they have got through a huge day like the budget and managed to avoid all the banana skins. But the second part, that is still a huge job of work to be done. And Theresa May is heading back to Brussels tomorrow to be back there pressing the flesh, to dangle a new and improved financial offer. A hypothetical cheque will be put on the table to try to persuade the Brussels establishments and those 27 other countries that by Christmas the UK and everyone else can agree that it's time to talk about the future. That is a huge and vital pressure for the Prime Minister, and compared to getting through a budget without big mistakes, might feel a lot harder.
Laura Kunsberg, thank you.
Now, when a respected expert describes the prospects for the economy as astonishing and pretty grim reading, well, you know things are bad. The head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies warned today that wages would not grow for a total of 17 years. His gloom was matched by the Resolution Foundation, which said that the poorest third of households are set for an average loss of £700 a year for the next 5 years. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this report.
There you were in Leeds College of Building, drawing attention to the housing measures announced in yesterday's budget. But think tanks crawling through the numbers published yesterday focused on darker stuff. The Institute for Fiscal Studies said it could be that the country's debt as a percentage of national income doesn't return to pre-crisis levels until the 2060s. And the Resolution Foundation said living standards could be heading for the longest period of stagnation since records began. If yesterday's downgraded growth forecasts turn out to be accurate, real terms average earnings may not get back to pre-crisis levels for another 8 years.
Incomes of families over the next few years look set to be squeezed, and actually it's the longest squeeze on family incomes since records began in the 1950s. That's because pay isn't expected to get back to the levels we saw before the financial crisis until 2025, 17 years after this crisis began.
The last Chancellor happily tweeted the IFS's grim news and splashed it on his newspaper's front page, despite years of playing down their verdicts on his own budgets.
When did you last have a pay rise that actually left you feeling better off?
I haven't. About 10 years ago. We just had one now, but it's too little. And it's 9 years since we had a pay rise, so.
I know in my company we've been fighting for years for a pay rise, but we've had to just basically agree on 2%, so I just don't think it's going to get any better.
In the Commons debate on the budget, one Tory MP told Labour's Shadow Chancellor the talk of misery was being overdone.
The people in Taunton Dean speak to me, they've actually got more money in their pockets, which is what they want. So people have actually got thousands more in their pockets than they had under the Labour government.
Can I just suggest this to her? That I don't wish to be patronising anyway. I just say that all of us who are on relatively high wages need to understand and be very careful when we talk about levels of income and levels of wealth, when we know so many people, 4 million of our children, are actually living in poverty.
Sir Michael Fallon.
One of the two cabinet ministers who resigned in recent weeks made his first appearance on the backbenches.
Let us agree across this House, Brexiteers and Europhiles alike, that muddling along, mere managerialism, is not going to be enough. Brexit Britain demands a bigger vision.
Tomorrow, the Prime Minister will be focused on Brexit, leaving Westminster for Brussels to test the ground on what extra money would buy Britain in the talks. Calling that wrong could turn a bleak outlook into a full-scale crisis.
Gary Gibbon. Now, following mounting pressure from MPs from all parties, yesterday's budget included measures to address some backbench criticisms over the way the new universal credit system is being rolled out. Many claimants have struggled to cope with long waits for the payments to come through. Today, the Work and Pension Secretary, David Gauke, announced that from next February, claimants would go on being paid housing benefit for 2 weeks after they apply for universal credit. This will cost the government £550 million, as, unlike the loans now being given to tide people over until their benefits arrive, these payments will not have to be repaid. Now, the government has also announced that the planned rollout of the benefit will be scaled down in February. As for claimants already being moved onto universal credit, they will now be able to receive up to 100% of the amount owed to them as emergency upfront payments. Right. Earlier, I spoke to David Gauke and asked him to explain why so much is being spent on a system which is supposed to save money.
Well, the whole point of universal credit was about transforming lives, about helping people
but also
get
make
into
it cheaper
work.
for the government.
Well, actually, the only savings within universal credit now are savings from reducing fraud and error, which universal credit, I'm pleased to say, does. But it is not essentially about saving money. It is essentially about transforming lives and helping people to progress in work.
Because it has transformed many lives, but many of those people would say, actually, it's made them much worse. I mean, it's left people penniless at a very delicate stage in their life as they're going through this rollout period. How is that possible? How could you get that so wrong?
Well, it's always been the case that advances have been available so that people were able to get 50% of their estimated first payment. The aim has always been to make that payment after 5 or 6 weeks, depending upon the particular circumstances. Frankly, earlier this year, we weren't able to do that as often as we would like. We've now improved the payment timeliness. There's still things that we want to do.
You sound very relaxed about it. We've interviewed people on the programme, the last few months, who have literally had zero money in their bank accounts. There are 6 million people in this country who have zero savings, who are in rent arrears, who are being kicked out of their properties. I mean, their lives, as a result of this thing being rolled out badly, have become miserable. That's their transformation.
Let's be clear, when it comes to evictions, there have been reports of housing associations evicting tenants because of universal credit. That's not been the case. But what we want to do is ensure that if people need to get money early, they can get money early, and that they're aware of it, that they do get paid the full amount promptly and on time, and we provide that additional support for those moving over from housing benefit. But let's not also forget, there's never been a benefit system that has been without problems and issues. Clearly, there have been cases where, DWP, we could have done things better. I'm not going to deny that, but that is very often the case with any system.
OK, just one other one on the other big word that came up in the budget yesterday, the P word, productivity. We're all talking about productivity now. Now, we went through every single one of the previous Chancellor's budget speeches from 2010 to 2015. You were in the Treasury at the time in various senior positions. There's not a single speech in which the P word, productivity, is mentioned by George Osborne, even though it was clearly, the current Chancellor tells us, a problem at the time. How could he not spot that?
Well, whether it featured in his speeches, actually, there's many things that we have done to help productivity. The challenge with productivity...
But if it's such a big issue, you want to bring it up in a budget, don't you?
Whether you use the productivity word, but, if you look at actually the welfare reform that we have undertaken over the last few years, whether you look at the reforms to the education system that Michael Gove, as Education Secretary, brought in, that's all about improving productivity. If you look at quite a lot of the infrastructure...
So you discussed it at the time?
Yeah, well, look, we've been focused on productivity all the way through. What I think we have to acknowledge...
You just didn't tell us.
Well, there've been many times, when productivity has been a driver of policy over the last 7 years. But I think what, I'd be the first to acknowledge is that when it comes to improving productivity, no one should pretend there's an immediate quick fix, that there's a lever that you pull and suddenly everything is transformed.
But you've been in power for 7 years.
But if you look at the greater focus on, for example, infrastructure, there are many things that we are doing. I think we have to be the first to acknowledge that you don't always get immediate returns to that.
But we're not asking for immediate returns. We're asking for returns, over a period of years, and you have been in charge for the last 7 of them.
Well, look,
and this has been an issue for the last 7 years.
Yeah, and over that time, we're seeing increased expenditure on transport infrastructure. We have made our corporate tax system more competitive, which helps encourage investment, and investment drives productivity improvements. That's all happened over the last 7 years.
But how come we're still so far down that list,
well, look,
the bottom of that list?
We do face challenges. Has to be said, since the financial crash, Western economies like the UK, we're not unique in this, face challenges with productivity growth. We started, you're absolutely right, we started lower down the list than we would like to, and there's still clearly more for us to do.
Many of us probably won't still be here in the 2060s in 40 years' time. I mean, here's hoping we all make it, but you never know. That, though, is how long it could take our national debt to get back to where it was before the financial crash, at least according to the analysts at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. The IFS's budget summary has always been keenly awaited, and it said today it agreed with the findings of the Resolution Foundation, which we reported last night, that pay could take another decade to return to pre-2008 levels. In other words, households are facing the biggest drop in living standards for 60 years. The Chancellor said today, as a nation, we've got to prove the predictions wrong.
Building an economy fit for the future is the government's claim for the budget. But there's a lot of building to do because the economy isn't very fit at all. In fact, wage growth has been pretty sickly.
What we did yesterday with the budget was set out a budget for an economy that's fit for the future. That's about ensuring that this country can embrace change. It's about ensuring that the country will meet challenges head on, but also seize future opportunities.
Trouble is, the economy needs a bit of rewiring. The main problem with it can't be fixed at the flick of a switch.
That's a long-term issue about the productivity of the British economy. That's why we're investing in infrastructure, that's why we're investing in skills, that's why we've taken big steps to encourage high-growth businesses, like the tech sector, which tend to be higher productivity and help to lift the performance of the economy overall.
But a lift is long overdue. Real average earnings were £24,500 in 2007. As you can see, they still haven't recovered. And now they're not expected to recover until 2025. That's 18 years just to get back to where they started. So the amount of money the Chancellor has is limited too. He did spend a bit yesterday, but will still be constrained in the future.
Is this the end of austerity?
This is definitively not the end of austerity. We've got some big spending cuts still in the pipeline, £12 billion of welfare cuts to come over the next few years, many billions of pounds in cuts in public service spending. We're a long way, I'm afraid, from the end of austerity.
All of which makes the government's economic record easier to attack, as Jeremy Corbyn did at a rally tonight.
They've racked up more borrowing and more debt. Wages are falling, growth is falling, investment is falling, public services are at risk of closing altogether. That's the record of 7 years of this Tory government.
Voters have been prepared to put up with austerity on the promise that things would get better. But the time when that is supposed to happen just keeps getting pushed further and further away. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, Westminster.
So, as Carl was just saying there, the Institute for Fiscal Studies is predicting 2 decades without any real-term growths in pay at all. Today, the IFS also focused on how sluggish our growth is due to be in the run-up to 2022. And as this graph clearly shows, it is worse here than for any other G7 nation, with the UK even lagging behind Italy and Canada, countries not generally regarded as economic powerhouses. I mean, Italy, it's one thing being beaten at football, but this is too much. Joel is here with me to discuss this. Look, this is a serious business, isn't it? Growth, we're down. I've heard so many explanations. I've heard, you know, some people say Brexit, some people say Bulls was right. We should have ploughed money into education these years ago. What do you assess is behind this?
Well, look, we are bottom of that table, Tom, and we were top of it just before the referendum last year. So it's tempting to blame Brexit. And you can see that while the fall in the pound has definitely contributed to a squeeze on living standards, and the uncertainty around what happens next is undoubtedly unhelpful, the economy has grown since the referendum, steadily, if unheroically. The downgrade we saw yesterday to economic future growth was everything to do with productivity and nothing to do with Brexit. That's what the OBR said very, very plainly. Productivity is a measure of, funny enough, what we produce for every hour that we work. Economists, most of them, will tell you it is a vitally important measure, the difference between economic success and failure. And since 2008, so this is a historic problem dating back over the last decade, for some reason that people just can't agree on, productivity growth has been feeble. So the key is to try and find some way of improving and reviving it. It's not a problem that is unique to Britain. It's a global issue, but it's hit us particularly
badly felt here. I mean, I guess we're all going to have to do some thinking about that. The other thing we talked about last night is this squeeze on wages. Many people will be feeling it. You've had a chance to look at the detail today.
Yeah, look, a downgrade lower, if the OBR's right, when we get lower economic growth, that's bad news for everyone. It leaves everyone worse off. But the Resolution Foundation has started looking about who in particular will be affected, and they have calculated that Hammond's budget will actually leave the poorest third of households hardest hit over the last 5 years. And that's because Philip Hammond effectively left the benefit freeze that George Osborne introduced in 2015 largely intact. It's got 2 years to run. Universal credit, which is less generous, is still being rolled out. A family, a couple, both in work on low earnings, therefore on benefits, with 3 children will be hardest hit, Tom. £4,100 a year worse off in 5 years' time.
That is really a huge sum. OK, Joel, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's go back to our political correspondent, Carl Dinnan, who is in Downing Street. Carl, so how do you think the Chancellor will be feeling about his budget 24 hours on?
Well, I think he'll be quietly pleased that it hasn't been a complete disaster in the way that his first budget was, or for that matter, the general election, or even the Conservative Party conference. When you consider all of those things, to have delivered a budget that still hangs together some 24 hours later is something of an achievement. He has also, at the same time, managed to placate the Brexiteers in his party, who have their suspicions about him, by putting aside money for Brexit. And he's managed to please the potential rebels who thought the introduction of universal credit was too harsh by getting rid of the 7-day wait. So he has made those political gains here. But the big fundamental problem that Joel has just been talking about in the economy still remains. Now, economists do say that he is doing the right things to try and fix the productivity problem, investing in infrastructure and education, yet it will take years before anyone sees any difference. In the meantime, voters will increasingly begin to wonder whether the Tory reputation as the party of economic competence really holds up, or whether it's time to try something different. And of course, there is a health warning across all of this. Not an economist in the country can tell you what real difference Brexit will make to the economy. It could make things better when it actually comes, or it could make things very much worse.
OK, Carl, thank you very much indeed.
Now, it's been around 36 hours since yesterday's budget, but in the past, well, we've seen plenty of them collapse completely in that kind of time frame. You'll remember George Osborne's omnishambles budget in 2012 and Philip Hammond's U-turn over national insurance contributions earlier this year. So let's get the day after reflections with our trio of editors, Nick Watt, Helen Thomas and Chris Cook, the three wise men and women who come bearing graphs. Very good evening to you all. Do we think you got away with it? 2 words, Helen?
Just about.
So far.
Nick, come on, they seem to be quite pleased with the response, right? I mean,
yes.
they feel they did get away with it.
Well, I was talking to one Tory grandee this afternoon who said Parliament felt like the Mary Celeste. It was light whipping, so there wasn't much for MPs to do, so they all went back to their constituencies, so there was no real feeling of plotting. This was a budget that landed as about as well as it could, given that dramatic downgrade in the economic forecast. Now, relations between number 10 and number 11 have been difficult, but from number 10 I'm hearing words like they're pleased with this, they thought it landed very well, and saying things like it was transparent about the real challenges from that downgrade that Helen will be talking about in a minute. And interestingly, the Prime Minister was out on a visit with Philip Hammond earlier today, and it looks pretty much like he has got a reprieve. She was asked a very simple question, is his job safe? Yes, he did a good job in the budget, she said.
Well, all peace and harmony. Well, let's talk about the economics a bit, Helen, because what's the headline of the day? I mean, we knew about
So yesterday we had these big downgrades, productivity growth, economic growth, and the knock-on effect on borrowing.
Yeah.
Today, the focus was much more on what that means in people's pockets. Now, look at this chart from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, and this was sort of the talk of the day, really. So you've got average annual earnings, their measure of earnings adjusted for inflation. This blue line, you can see the peak before the financial crisis, big drop and a partial recovery. Now, back in March 2016, if you look at this next line, you know, the ABR, the official forecasts were a nice steady recovery. So, you know, by 2021, we're back more or less to that
caught up,
that peak. Exactly. Now, the latest forecasts.
The green dotted line.
The green line.
Right.
Very different picture, flat outlook and a modest recovery.
Yeah.
Now,
has anyone extrapolated that line to see when it actually gets back to where we were in 2008?
They have. So the two things to look at here are the gap. So 2021, that gap is about £1,400. So that's sort of,
you know, the
average earnings are, yeah, exactly. That's been forecast away. And as you say, 2023, we're nowhere near back to the peak. So that's already 15 years of lost earnings growth. And this is buying power, this is living standards, you know, this is what really matters to people.
And we should say, because a lot of people have been saying to me today, oh, it's all Brexit, presumably.
No, I mean, this isn't Brexit, and I think it's important to say that, you know, actually what's baked into these forecasts about Brexit is actually, you know, quite smooth, because we just don't know.
Because they've just had to make a bunch of assumptions, and they're not car crash assumptions.
And the other thing to say is, you know, these are forecasts, and economists, it turns out, do occasionally get their numbers wrong.
Maybe now the fact that they've told us to carry an umbrella, the sun will shine.
Well, exactly, but the fact is, the fact that this is baked into the official forecasts now means, you know, it just reflects that that productivity, earnings, living standards, it's a long-term problem, and it's a real challenge.
Chris, yesterday you were speaking to us about the NHS and the difficulties it's going to face. What are the options they're looking at then to kind of make life within the budget they've got, which is not the one they wanted?
Well, the critical thing to remember about the NHS in England is that it's not like other government departments, because it has its own chief executive and board that are not the government. They are operationally independent. They have this big thing that's published every year called the NHS Mandate, which gives them a list of targets. And they basically are going to decide next week they can't meet their targets. They can't do what they're being paid to do. Let me give you one example. One of their targets is the so-called RTT target, which says that basically from a referral to getting to consultant-led treatment, you shouldn't have to wait more than 18 weeks. And basically, they think it will cost 2 to 3 billion quid next year to do a one-off sorting out the waiting
Because they're missing
list.
that target quite a bit at the moment.
Exactly.
Right. 2 billion to get back into the target.
2 to 3 billion to sort of bring the waiting list backlog down to where they need it to be. Then about £500 million a year after that, so that they can sort of keep it under control. They've only got 1.6 billion quid extra next year, so they can't do that one target, let alone all of them. So that's what next week is going to be all about. Which targets do we meet? Which ones don't we meet? It's not going to be saying we will no longer do hips.
Right.
It's going to be saying,
or these cancer drugs are not available.
Exactly. It's going to be sort of more delay, which is not really a saving, it's a deferring of spending. And it's going to be saying your quality of care is going to decline, the amount of time, the speed at which you'll get care is going to decline. That's really where the conversation is.
I mean, Nick, looking ahead, I mean, presumably the government think we've managed to stabilise the patient that is this government. It's actually okay now. Are they hoping they...
Well, to coin a phrase, it has been Theresa May's annus horribilis. There was the budget in March that backfired, there was the general election that backfired, and then her conference speech. And this is the first big event for this government this year that so far is going well. The question is this now a turning point? Two big challenges she's got to get through. Firstly, as Chris was saying, she's got to not have a winter fuel crisis. And secondly, can those Brexit negotiations move on to the next stage, future trade transition? Prime Minister seeing Donald Tusk, European Council President, tomorrow. That is the beginning of a process that over the next 10 days, they will outline, the UK will outline the extra money it's putting on the table. But will the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, dig in? And if he digs in and the EU still listen to him, maybe he could hold up the sufficient progress.
Plenty of action. Thank you all very much indeed.